let's say, the arrival of the Portuguese in this part of the world in 1500 or so as the beginning of a catastrophe. On the other hand, you think, how did they get here? They stopped, Vasco da Gama and his team stopped at a place called Malindi, which is on the coast of Kenya. The reason it took them so long to get from around the Cape to this place called Malindi is because they didn't know about the currents and they didn't know about the monsoon winds. So they struggled. They arrived at the wrong season. But when they got to Malindi, they found a pilot who was in fact himself an Indian, who said, "I know the way, foolish man. I know the way to guide you from this place to India." So the large history, if you like, the shadow of this history is Vasco da Gama's arrival. The small part of this history is that perhaps he might not have got here if there wasn't a man to guide him to this place. Or maybe such events are inevitable. So maybe sooner or later he would have got here, one way or another. You hear that? There's competition. So, are events that we think of as history, are these events inevitable? They would have happened anyway, or are they avoidable? Could they have been avoidable? I think I've provoked them. They're trying even harder now. So, well, I don't know if we can answer that question about whether they're avoidable or whether they're not. But in any case, it's an issue, it's a thought that once events have happened, as if we assume that they would have happened anyway. But maybe that's not always the case. I began by saying that when we use a phrase like shadows of history, we assume that history is a tragic narrative. And we put alongside it the second half of what is in fact the title of my talk and the title of this festival, which is Lights of the Future. Incidentally, if you look, at least in the version of it that I got, if you look at that, there's a semicolon between Shadows of History and Lights of the Future. I'm not sure what semicolons actually do in practice, what they mean, but I found it puzzling to see a semicolon there between these two phrases. And I thought if we had time, and if I was better informed about semiotics, we might have found it an interesting little exercise to investigate why the semicolon is there, or indeed what interpretation we can give to it. But we don't have time, thankfully, to do that. We'll move on. I think the semicolon there performs a kind of balancing act. On the one hand, shadows of history, dark, dark narrative, the past, bad things, although I'm suggesting that maybe there's a more subtle way of thinking about that. In any case, Lights of the Future is what balances that dark narrative. A bit like, the idea of the world in the classical, by which I mean, say, the Greek geography, is that the world is, of course, flat, and the top of it, or one end of it, is this huge landmass, as it seemed to them, of Europe and Asia. And they didn't really know about the rest of it. They knew about the Mediterranean. They didn't know how much land there was below that, as it was south of that. But they thought there must be a huge continent down there, because otherwise that flat world would topple over. So there must be a huge mass of land the other end to balance this disk of the world. And so, in a sense, Lights of the Future is performing this sort of function. So there's Shadows of History on the one hand, and counterpoised by Lights of the Future, like that Ptolemaic conception of a world which would otherwise spin out of control. And existence, of course, proves that nothing like that ever happens. Nothing quite spins out of control. So even if there hadn't been a huge landmass, fortunately there was, but in any case, the world turned out not to be flat after all. When we think about the future, and we think about it as lights of the future, we are actually confronted by quite dark prophecies about what the future holds. Climate change, wars that seem to never end or do not promise to be about to end. And when we think about those kinds of things, as opposed to the kind of optimistic, hopeful things that we might say to ourselves, the future means progress, the future means we will be less poor, or we will be kinder, and all of those things. At the same time, we have these other prophecies that we live with. And I wonder if we actually have learned to contemplate the inconceivable, as it were. When you hear projections and prophecies about what's going to happen to the world, it seems as if, even if it's not quite said like that, that we're heading towards extinction. So, in a sense, have we learned to contemplate that inconceivable idea? Have we gone too far? So, for some people, anyway, talk of the future is futile because there isn't one. It is just a kind of blindfolding ourselves in the present when we speak of the future in this way. Unless we're not those people, unless we do really think that there is light in the future, we do really believe and hope that there is both room, space, and the resourcefulness for a better world.